If I told you a global superpower lost its chance to win World War II in under 5 minutes, would you believe it? This is the true story of how Japan's unstoppable war machine collapsed almost instantly, and why no one saw it coming. On June 4th, 1942, across the vast empty waters of the Pacific, a powerful Japanese carrier fleet steamed toward Midway Island. On paper, this was the most lethal strike force on Earth, the same fleet that had crushed everything in its path across Asia and the Pacific. Their commanders believed that Americans would be swept aside just as easily as everyone before them, but what they didn't know was that their entire plan had already been exposed. What they didn't know was that American carriers were waiting in the exact spot they were about to pass through, and what they could never have imagined was that a single hesitation, a single wrong decision, would turn the mightiest fleet in Japanese history into a floating graveyard. It began with misread signals, broken intelligence, and ended with 5 minutes that shattered Japan's chance of winning World War II. Before the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Empire stood at the very peak of its power. From December 1941 to early 1942, their advance across Asia and the Pacific was nothing short of terrifying. In just 6 months, Japan had conquered a territory larger than Nazi Germany at its height. Hong Kong had fallen. Malaya and Singapore, once considered impregnable, surrendered in humiliation. The Philippines collapsed after months of desperate fighting. Guam, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies. One by one, they all fell beneath the rising sun. To the world watching from afar, Japan looked invincible, and to the Japanese High Command, the message was clear. Their strategy was working. Their navy, the legendary Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force in human history, had delivered victory after victory with surgical precision. Wherever these carriers sailed, destruction followed. At the heart of this armada were 4 elite aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru. These were not mere ships. They were floating fortresses, mobile airfields, symbols of a new era in warfare, where power came not from battleships, but from the sky. The pilots who flew from them were among the finest the world had ever seen. Men trained in harsh, unforgiving programs with a washout rate so high that only the very best survived. They were veterans of the war in China, masters of the Zero fighter, and believed, with good reason, that no enemy pilot could match their skill to the Japanese leadership. America was seen as soft, divided, and unprepared. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the US battleship fleet, and the stunning Japanese victories across the Pacific seemed to prove that the Americans lacked both the will and the ability to fight back. But Japan's confidence was also its greatest weakness. Their victories had come so quickly, so overwhelmingly, that many Japanese commanders began to believe they were destined to dominate the Pacific. They believed their pilots were unbeatable, their ships were untouchable, their plans were flawless, and with this mindset, Japan prepared the next major step of its strategy: the capture of Midway Island. Midway was a tiny speck of land in the middle of the ocean, barely visible on most maps. But its location was priceless. It sat like a forward outpost guarding Hawaii, the beating heart of American power in the Pacific. If Japan took Midway, the US Pacific Fleet would be forced to retreat to California. Hawaii would be isolated. American supply lines would collapse. In Tokyo, the idea was simple. Midway would be the trap. It would draw out the last remaining American carriers and destroy them once and for all. Without carriers, America would have no chance of recovering. Japan could negotiate peace from a position of absolute strength. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed this was the moment that would decide the entire war. He was a master strategist, a man who understood both the power of the aircraft carrier and the industrial might of the United States. He knew Japan had a narrow window to crush America before American factories could awaken to win the war. Japan had to break the American fleet now, quickly, completely, and so the plan to seize Midway was put into motion. On maps, it appeared flawless, a multi-pronged deception to confuse US intelligence, a lightning assault supported by battleships and cruisers, and a decisive blow delivered by the Kido Butai. It was designed with precision, executed with confidence, and supported by the belief that Japan would dominate the air and sea as it always had. But beneath this veneer of perfection lay a fatal flaw, a strategic arrogance that blinded Japan to what was really happening, because while Japan saw itself as unstoppable, the Americans were not beaten. They were preparing, they were listening, and thanks to one group of codebreakers in Hawaii, they already knew exactly where Japan was heading. Japan believed Midway would be their triumph, but in reality, Midway was the beginning of their downfall. For the Japanese High Command, the plan to capture Midway was meant to be elegant, decisive, and impossible for the Americans to counter. But in reality, it was a masterpiece of overthinking, a plan so complex that it undermined itself before the first shot was even fired. Admiral Yamamoto believed deception was the key to victory. He divided the Japanese fleet into multiple groups, spread across hundreds of miles of open ocean. On paper, it looked impressive. One group would attack Midway, another would ambush any American carriers, while battleships and cruisers waited far behind to deliver the killing blow. But this complexity came at a cost. It costs no one in the Japanese Navy recognized until it was too late. The Japanese fleet was now so widely dispersed that it could barely communicate with itself. Radio silence, enforced to maintain secrecy, meant that each group sailed blind, unaware of the other's exact positions, unable to react to sudden developments. If one part of the plan failed, the others would not know. If American forces appeared unexpectedly, no group could reinforce another in time. This wasn't a single, unified hammer strike. It was 5 separate blows, all aimed at the same target, but delivered at different times. And the Americans, they didn't fall for the deception at all. Yamamoto had spread his forces thin to confuse an enemy who already knew exactly where he was going. Thanks to American codebreakers, the US Navy understood the Japanese plan more clearly than many Japanese commanders themselves. They knew which group would strike Midway. They knew which direction the carriers would approach from. They even knew the approximate date of the attack. But Japan's confidence was unshaken. Their commanders believed the Americans were too weak, too outnumbered, too demoralized to put up any meaningful resistance. They believed that even if the Americans showed up, Japan's carrier fleet, the Kido Butai, would crush them quickly. So they continued with the plan, unaware that its very structure made it fragile. The Japanese fleet was like a grand machine with many moving parts. But machines only work when every piece operates perfectly. And war rarely provides perfection. Even the smallest disruption could throw the entire operation into chaos. One delayed message, one sighting report arriving minutes too late, one unexpected enemy movement, This complexity also slowed Japanese decisions. While American commanders had a clear, focused strategy, protect Midway and ambush the Japanese carriers, Japan's admirals had to sift through layers of possibilities, contingencies, and misleading assumptions. And at the heart of this maze of confusion stood Admiral Kido Nagumo, the man in charge of the carrier strike force. He was a traditionalist, more experienced with battleships than carriers, and he was about to face the most critical decision of the entire battle, one that required instant clarity, lightning-fast judgment, and total situational awareness. Instead, he would be forced to make that decision with fragmented information, scattered reports, and a plan so intricate it trapped him rather than guided him. Japan's first fatal mistake was not a tactical error or a bad decision. It was the belief that a perfect plan could overcome imperfect circumstances. In war, simplicity wins, clarity wins, flexibility wins. But at Midway, Japan entered battle with none of these advantages. Their fate was already leaning toward disaster, and they didn't even know it yet. While Japan sailed toward Midway with confidence, something critical was happening thousands of miles away, something quiet, invisible, and far more decisive than any movement of ships. Inside a small, cramped basement beneath a building at Pearl Harbor, a group of American codebreakers were performing what many believed was impossible. They were breaking Japan's most secure military code, JN25. This was not glamorous work. There were no aircraft, no battleships, no explosions, just pencils, typewriters, stacks of intercepted messages, and the relentless determination of a man named Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was not a typical military officer. He wore slippers to work. He drank so much coffee that his desk was permanently stained. His hair was unkempt, and his uniform often looked like it had lost a war of its own. But beneath his eccentric appearance was one of the sharpest minds in the US Navy. Rochefort and his team had spent months analyzing thousands of random numbers transmitted by the Japanese fleet. Slowly, painfully, they began to understand patterns, fragments of words, hints of locations, pieces of schedules, and at last, they discovered something extraordinary. The Japanese were planning a massive operation. They kept mentioning a target called AF, but what was AF? A base? A convoy? An island? The answer would determine the entire direction of America's defensive strategy. Rochefort had a theory. AF was Midway. But in intelligence work, theories mean nothing without proof. So he devised a simple but brilliant test. He instructed the Midway garrison to send an unencrypted message, one they knew the Japanese would overhear, saying that their freshwater system had broken within hours. Japanese communications reported that AF is running low on water. That was the moment everything clicked. The Japanese Empire, convinced of its own secrecy, had just confirmed the very target it hoped to conceal. And from that point on, the Americans knew almost every part of the Japanese plan. They knew the date of the attack. They knew the direction of approach. They knew the approximate size of the fleet. Japan thought it was springing a trap on the Americans. But in truth, it was Japan walking blindly into America's trap. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence had completely failed. Their reconnaissance flights were poorly timed. Their submarines were deployed too late to detect American carriers, and their high command dismissed early warning signs because they believed the Americans were still too weak to fight. Back this arrogance, this belief that the enemy could not possibly outthink them was fatal, and it meant that when the Japanese fleet reached Midway, they had no idea 3 American carriers were already waiting in perfect ambush positions. Japan's greatest mistake was not on the battlefield. It was in the mind. They underestimated an opponent who had just outsmarted them at the most crucial moment of the Pacific War. As the sun rose on June 4, 1942, Japan believed they held the advantage, but in reality they were sailing straight toward their own destruction. Their blindness was America's opportunity, and that opportunity would soon explode across the skies above Midway. At dawn on June 4, 1942, the first act of the Battle of Midway began. Japanese aircraft roared off the decks of Akagi Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the mighty carriers of the Kido Butai. Their mission was simple: destroy Midway's airfields, soften the island's defenses, and prepare the way for an invasion. The initial strike did significant damage, but not enough. Midway's runways were still usable, its fuel tanks were intact, and its anti-aircraft guns were very much alive. The Japanese air commander radioed back a crucial message. They would need a second strike to finish the job. This message landed on the desk and on the conscience of one man, Vice Admiral Kido Nagumo, and now Nagumo faced a decision that would determine the fate of the entire Japanese empire. Nagumo's dilemma. When the Midway strike group launched, Nagumo had kept half of his aircraft in reserve. Those planes were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons meant to sink ships, not attack land targets. This was standard Japanese procedure. Be prepared for both targets. But then came an unexpected and deeply troubling report. American ships had been sighted nearby, possibly carriers. Suddenly Nagumo was trapped between 2 urgent priorities. He could launch a second strike on Midway before the island's defenses recovered, or he could arm the reserve planes with anti-ship weapons and attack the American fleet. He could not do both, and time was running out. The dangerous decision. Nagumo hesitated. The report of American ships was vague, a fleeting sighting by a single scout plane. No position, no formation, no confirmation that carriers were present without full information. Nagumo made what he believed was the safe, logical choice. He ordered the planes in the hangars to be rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Bombs for land targets replaced torpedoes. Fuel lines and munitions were left exposed on the hangar decks. It was a routine procedure, but a deadly one, because minutes later, another message arrived. This time, it was clear. American carriers were definitely nearby. Nagumo froze. He now needed anti-ship weapons immediately, but the aircraft he had just reconfigured were in the middle of switching equipment. To reverse the process would take precious minutes, maybe an hour. In this moment, Nagumo was fighting not the Americans, but the unforgiving limitations of time and logistics. A fleet caught unprepared Japanese carriers operated with their hangar decks packed tightly with aircraft, munitions, and fuel, a system designed for maximum efficiency and rapid strikes. But it also meant that during rearming operations, the ships were extraordinarily vulnerable. Bombs lay scattered across the decks. Torpedoes were stacked in rows. Fuel hoses snaked across the floor. And dozens of fully fueled aircraft were parked, wingtip to wingtip. One spark, one explosion, would turn any of the carriers into an inferno. Nagumo's hesitation had placed the entire Kido Butai in its most dangerous state. The fatal window at 7:15 a.m. Nagumo made his final decision. He would wait. He would recover the returning aircraft from the first strike, reorganize, and then launch a full, coordinated assault on the American fleet. But this decision required time. Time Japan no longer had by waiting. Nagumo opened a narrow, deadly window, a window during which all 4 of his carriers were armed, fueled, loaded with explosives, and completely unprepared for an attack. It was in that moment, that fragile, precarious moment, that fate turned against Japan. The greatest carrier force on Earth had just become the most vulnerable, and American dive bombers were already on their way. As Nagumo's carriers scrambled to rearm, refuel, and reorganize, another force entered the battlefield, a force small in number, outdated in technology, and tragically unprepared for what was waiting above the Pacific. This was the first American counterattack, and it would become one of the most important failures in military history. The desperate strike from Midway at roughly 6 a.m. Aircraft launched from Midway Island began their assault on the Japanese fleet. These were not the sleek, modern fighters and bombers that Hollywood imagines. They were older machines, worn down, underpowered, and hopelessly outclassed by the agile Japanese Zeros. But the pilots who flew them understood exactly what they were doing. They were buying time. Wave after wave took to the skies, B-26s, B-17s, Marine Corps dive bombers, torpedo planes barely held together by bolts and hope, and one by one, they hurled themselves toward the most dangerous naval force in the world. A brutal encounter there. Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the elite Zero fighters, descended on them with terrifying speed. In minutes, American formations disintegrated, bombs missed, torpedoes malfunctioned, entire squadrons were wiped out. For many pilots, this was a one-way mission, and they knew it before they even left the runway. One Marine aviator, mortally wounded, pushed his burning aircraft into a shallow dive, aiming it directly at a Japanese carrier. His plane crashed into the sea just short of the target. He never hesitated. Their attack achieved almost nothing. Tactically, but strategically, it achieved everything. The unexpected consequence to repeated American strikes forced the Japanese fleet to constantly change course, constantly maneuver, constantly react. Every time a new group of American planes appeared, the Zero fighters were pulled lower and lower, dragged into chaotic dogfights far below the clouds. This meant that when the moment of destiny arrived later that morning, there would be almost no Japanese fighters left at high altitude to defend the carriers. Japan's fragile state exposed as the American attacks broke apart and fell into the sea. They caused another effect, one Nagumo could not afford. The Japanese carriers had been forced to keep their decks clear for defensive fighter launches. This delayed the rearming of torpedo bombers. It pushed back the recovery of the first Midway strike group. It interrupted the movement of bombs, torpedoes, and fueled lines inside the hangars. It created chaos. By the time the Midway attackers returned, the Japanese decks were still full of waiting aircraft and loose munitions. Planes circled above, low on fuel, desperately needing to land. Inside the hangars, bombs lay scattered. Fuel hoses dripped onto the floor. The carriers were one spark away from catastrophe. The real purpose of the American attack Most of the American pilots never returned home. Their sacrifice appeared meaningless to many commanders at first, but history would prove otherwise. Their attack may have failed on the surface, but it tore apart Japan's schedule, disrupted their rhythm, exhausted their pilots, and exposed their carriers at the worst possible moment, because while the skies above Midway were filled with fire and smoke, far beyond the horizon, high above the clouds, another group of Americans was still searching for the Japanese fleet, searching for the perfect moment, and soon they would find it. These doomed early assaults, these so-called failures, opened the door for victory. Without them, the decisive strike would never have been possible. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It was the turning of the key, unlocking the 5 minutes that would change the entire war. While the early American attacks were being slaughtered over the Pacific, far to the east, a different story was unfolding. A quiet story. A story of navigation, instinct, and a single decision that would rewrite the fate of nations. The dive bombers get lost high above the clouds. The dive bomber squadrons from USS Enterprise were searching for the Japanese fleet. But the Pacific is vast, unimaginably vast, and the ocean reveals nothing to those who look from thousands of feet above. The Americans scanned the endless blue and saw nothing. They were running low on fuel. The sun was rising higher. Their navigation estimates were drifting, and worst of all, they were alone, cut off from the torpedo squadrons that had already sacrificed themselves. By all logic, they should have turned back. If they had, Japan would almost certainly have won the day. Wade McClusky makes a choice. The man leading the lost dive bombers was Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, a calm, disciplined pilot known for his steady judgment as he swept his formation across the ocean. A glint appeared far below, a lone Japanese destroyer, racing at full speed. To most pilots, this would mean nothing. A destroyer alone in the ocean was hardly unusual, but McClusky noticed something odd. The ship wasn't patrolling. It wasn't screening the fleet. It was moving fast, too fast, and in a straight, unwavering line. It was heading somewhere, with purpose. Mick, CLU, Sky made a decision that would change the course of the war. He turned his entire squadron to follow the destroyer's wake. If he was wrong, they would run out of fuel and crash into the sea. If he was right, they would find the heart of the Japanese. Navy. The fleet reveals itself for 10 long minutes. The American pilots followed the destroyer through the empty sky. Then, almost as if the curtain of the ocean had been pulled back, the horizon shifted. There they were. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Kagasoyu decks, crowded with aircraft, hangars filled with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel, every ship consumed in chaos from the earlier American attacks. McClusky had not just found the Japanese fleet. He had found it in its most vulnerable moment. The one moment the Japanese thought could never happen. 5 minutes before Destinier, the exact time the Americans appeared. Every Japanese carrier was exposed. Flight decks cluttered with aircraft being refueled. Bombs and torpedoes lying unsecured, fuel lines stretched across the hangars, and fighters at low altitude, chasing the earlier Midway attackers. Japan's air defenses were scattered, their carriers were wide open, and fate had brought the Americans to the perfect altitude, the perfect position. at the perfect moment. None of this was planned. None of it was coordinated. It was chance, boldness, and timing aligning with breathtaking precision. The stage is set as McClusky and his pilots banked into formation. They understood exactly what they were seeing. This was not simply an opportunity. This was destiny handing them the war itself. The earlier failed attacks had dragged Japanese fighters away. Nagumo's hesitation had frozen the carriers in a deadly state, and a single destroyer's unusual course had led the Americans straight to the target. McClusky steadied his voice over the radio. 2 words: prepare to dive. The men tightened their harnesses. The ocean rose beneath them. Japan's carriers filled their sight. They were seconds away from delivering the most devastating attack in naval history. The 5 minutes that would destroy Japan's hopes of victory were about to begin. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the sky above the Japanese fleet split open. From nearly 3,000 meters up, the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attack. Engines roared, dive brakes screamed, and the calm blue of the Pacific suddenly became a vertical plunge into fire and steel. What happened next lasted just 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes shattered everything the Japanese Empire had built. The fall of the Koga McCluskey's Group dove first. Targeting the massive carrier Kaga's flight deck was a chaos of activity. Fully fueled aircraft stood wingtip to wingtip. Armored torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across the floor. Fuel lines snaked across the deck like veins. When the Dauntlesses appeared, the Japanese crews froze. They had no time to clear the deck. No time to launch fighters. No time to do anything but look up and see death falling from the sky. Bomb after bomb tore into Kaga's deck. The first exploded near the island structure, blasting fuel and shrapnel across the hangar. The next punched directly into the heart of the ship, igniting torpedoes stacked below. Within seconds, Kaga transformed into a tower of flame so bright that American pilots felt the heat even as they pulled away. Kaga was finished. 1 carrier down, Akagi, the flagship falls. Another flight of Dauntlesses descended on Akagi, the pride of the Kido Butai, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo. Only 1 bomb was needed. It struck the middeck, piercing through the wooden planks and sook, detonating beside a fully fueled aircraft being prepared for the next strike. That single explosion set off a chain reaction. Fuel, bombs, torpedoes, all ignited at once. In moments, Akagi's hangars became a furnace. Officers tried desperately to contain the fire, but it was hopeless. The flames moved faster than any crew could respond. Nagumo stood on the bridge and watched his flagship die beneath him. 2 carriers gone. Soryu meets the same fate to the northeast. Another American squadron spotted the carrier Soryu, just like her sisters. She was caught in the worst possible moment. Decks crowded. Planes fueled. 3 bombs struck her in the space of seconds. 1 collapsed her flight deck. Another ignited the hangar. The third triggered explosions that ripped through the bow. Soryu burned so fiercely that sailors were forced to leap into the sea to escape the heat. 3 carriers, crippled beyond recovery. All in under 5 minutes. The shockwave, the Japanese commanders could not comprehend what had just happened. Moments earlier, The Kido Butai had been the most powerful naval formation on Earth, feared across the Pacific. Undefeated since Pearl Harbor. Now, in the span of a single breath of history, it was in ruins. Admirals shouted orders no one could execute. Sailors ran across melting decks. Pilots circled helplessly above burning ships, unable to land, watching their home disappear beneath them. The invincible empire had been brought to its knees by a handful of dive bombers. The aftermath of the 5 minutes the sea boiled with fire. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. The sound of secondary explosions echoed like thunder. In those 5 minutes, Japan did not simply lose ships. They lost their best pilots. They lost their strategic initiative. They lost the core of their naval air power, something they would never again be able to rebuild. The tide of the Pacific War turned. In less time than it takes to boil a pot of water. A moment that changed the world when the dauntless pilots pulled out of their dives and looked back. They did not cheer. They simply stared, stunned at the scale of destruction they had unleashed. 3 carriers were burning from bow to stern. The 4th hero still remained, but even she could not change what had already happened. The Japanese Empire had suffered a wound from which it would never fully recover. In 5 minutes, the trajectory of World War II shifted forever. The greatest naval triumph the world had ever seen had just taken place. As the smoke of the burning carriers rose into the sky, one Japanese ship still remained untouched. One ship still had the power to strike back. This was the Hairyu, the 4th carrier of the Kido Butai. And in the midst of unimaginable chaos, Hirose commanders made a decision worthy of legend. They would not retreat. They would not surrender. Hairyu would fight alone. This was the final heartbeat of Japan's once unstoppable carrier force. Hairyu launches a counterattack against all odds. Hairyu still had operational aircraft and a handful of elite pilots determined to avenge their fallen comrades. Within minutes of receiving news of the disaster, Hairyu launched her first wave. The target, the American carrier believed to be closest to the attack, USS Yorktown. The Japanese pilots flew with a level of desperation that only comes when everything else has already been lost. They had witnessed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu vanish beneath firestorms. Now, they carried the burden of the Empire's last hope. Their attack was precise, disciplined, deadly. Yorktowns. Lookouts barely had time to shout a warning before dive bombers broke through the clouds. Bombs slammed into the American deck, triggering explosions that shook the entire ship. Fire ripped across the flight deck. For a moment, Yorktown seemed doomed, but American damage control crews were unmatched. They fought the fires. They restored power. They brought the ship back from the brink so effectually that later Japanese pilots, arriving for a second strike, believed it must be a different carrier. Still, Hero's second wave struck again. And this time, Yorktown could not be saved. The proud ship drifted to a halt as her crew abandoned her. She would not sink until days later, but Heru had achieved something the other Japanese carriers could not. She had killed an American. The Americans respond, but Heru's triumph was short-lived. While her pilots attacked Yorktown, American reconnaissance planes spotted her position, the final beating heart of Japan's carrier force. The order was immediate. Launch all dive bombers. This time, the Americans approached with overwhelming numbers, and full altitude advantage. Hiryu's remaining fighters rose to meet them, but too few remained to turn the tide. The dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attack, echoing the same devastating maneuvers that had destroyed the other three carriers. Earlier that morning, bombs fell straight and true. One tore through the flight deck, another ignited fuel lines below. A third set off torpedoes stored near the hangar. In an instant, flames erupted across the carrier. Black smoke swallowed the ship from bow to stern. Hiryu's final moments, Admiral Yamaguchi, the carrier's commanding officer, stood calmly on the bridge as his ship burned beneath him. He refused evacuation, choosing instead to die with Hiryu and the men who served under him. It was a symbolic gesture, a final act of honor, from a naval tradition that valued loyalty above life. As night fell, Hiryu slipped beneath the waves. Her sinking marked the end of the Kido Butai, the elite strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. 4 carriers lost, hundreds of veteran pilots gone, thousands of sailors dead. Japan had not simply lost ships, it had lost the core of its naval soul, a last breath of fire for a few brief hours. Hiryu had carried the weight of an empire. Her lone counterattack was bold, courageous, and tactically impressive. But nothing could change what had already happened earlier that morning. The other carriers were gone. Japan's best pilots were gone, and no amount of bravery could rebuild what had been destroyed in those 5 devastating minutes. Hiryu burned with fierce dignity, and then she vanished beneath the Pacific. With her passing, the age of Japanese naval dominance came to an end. As the fires of Hiryu faded into the night, a stillness settled over the Pacific, the kind of silence that follows the end of something enormous, something irreversible. The Battle of Midway was over, and the Japanese Empire would never be the same again. Japan's irreversible loss in the space of a single day. Japan had suffered a blow from which it could never recover. For frontline carriers Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Heiru lay at the bottom of the sea. These were not just ships. They were the backbone of Japan's naval air power, the weapons that had won victory after victory since Pearl Harbor. Along with them died nearly all of Japan's veteran pilots, men who could not be replaced, because Japan's training system was built for peacetime. Levels of attrition. Each pilot lost was a decade of experience, gone forever. The Empire had not simply lost machines, it had lost mastery. Why Japan could never recover Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Even before Midway, the balance of production was already tipping against them. But after Midway, it wasn't a contest anymore. America would go on to build dozens of carriers, Essex-class giants, Independence-class light carriers, escort carriers, night fighter carriers. Japan, with its limited resources, could only build a few replacements, and none fast enough or strong enough to change the course of the war. The Kido Butai, the proud, unmatched strike force that had once dominated the Pacific, was gone forever. The shift in momentum before Midway, Japan was on the offensive. After Midway, Japan never launched another major expansion. The empire switched from conquering to surviving. Every battle after Midway, Guadalcanal, the Aleutians, the Solomons, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, reflected this shift. Japan was now fighting a war of attrition it could not win. America had time, supplies, fuel, steel, manpower. Japan had none of these advantages anymore. The tide had turned. Midway's true significance. Midway was not just a battle. It was a hinge of history. Had Japan won, the Pacific would have looked very different. Hawaii might have been isolated. American morale could have fractured. Japan could have negotiated peace from a position of power, but they didn't. Instead, in 5 minutes of fire and steel, Japan's dream of dominating the Pacific was lost. Midway was the moment the war began to belong to the United States. A legacy. Written in fire, the battle has been studied for decades by historians, admirals, strategists, and the conclusion is always the same. This was Japan's turning point. Not because the Americans were invincible, but because the Japanese believed they were. Arrogance, complex planning, intelligence failures, Nagumo's hesitation, the brave sacrifices of American aviators, a destroyer running in the wrong direction, a dive bomber squadron that refused to give up. All of these threads came together in those 5 extraordinary minutes. Final reflection. As dawn broke on June 5th, the Pacific was filled with oil slicks, burning wreckage, and the shadows of 4 lost carriers. For the Americans, Midway became a symbol of resilience. The moment a wounded nation stood back up. For the Japanese Empire, it marked the beginning of a long, inevitable decline. In the end, Midway teaches us a simple truth. Wars are not always decided by strength. Sometimes they are decided by timing, information, and the courage of men who refused to retreat. Those 5 minutes did not just sink ships. They reshaped the world. When the last flames of Midway finally died out, the Pacific Ocean returned to silence, but it was not the same ocean. And this was not the same war. America had risen from the shock of Pearl Harbor, and Japan had begun a long descent from which it would never return. The victory at Midway did not end World War II, but it changed its direction. Permanently. It proved that knowledge can be more powerful than steel, that timing can outweigh numbers, and that courage, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can reshape the future. The men who fought here are gone now. Their ships rest on the ocean floor, their voices lost to time, but their legacy lives on in the world they helped shape. Midway is a reminder of how quickly fate can turn. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes was all it took to alter the destiny of nations. And in those minutes, history chose its path. Thank you for watching, and until the next story, remember, history is not just something we study, it is something we inherit. Fade out.